The concept of the shocking cost of goodness might seem like rhetoric until one starts to examine who advances, who is shielded, and who silently bears the consequences in different situations. I initially believed the conventional idea that honesty generates confidence, confidence builds a good name, and a solid good name leads to success. It appeared straightforward. However, it's not the full story. In 2012, Cameron Anderson, an organizational psychologist at the University of California, Berkeley, released findings indicating that one's position within a group isn't determined by their moral qualities, but by how capable and assertive they appear. Those who displayed dominance and skill were typically favored, not those who were necessarily the most moral or selfless. I recall thinking this shouldn't be so relevant, yet it is. In controlled group exercises, participants who were agreeable were well-liked, but the more forceful individuals were the ones others looked to for guidance. The distinction between being liked and being followed is bigger than we acknowledge. Consider data on promotions in companies. A study over a long time, managed by Timothy Judge, discovered that being very agreeable, a key trait among the big 5 personality traits, had a negative link with earnings. The effect isn't dramatic, but it's consistent. Over time, agreeable workers tend to earn less compared to those who are less so. A common reason given for this is how they negotiate. People who are agreeable tend to steer clear of disagreements and don't push hard. Though, this explanation seems a bit too simple. It's rarely said openly, but consistent morality makes one less of a strategic concern. If you're known for always doing what's right no matter what, it's safe to ignore you. You won't strike back, and you won't upset the order. I've witnessed this in action in meetings with senior people. When money is tight, the good manager picks up extra work. The difficult manager objects takes it to higher-ups and bargains. When job cuts occur, the agreeable manager is seen as valuable but easy to replace, while the difficult one is called essential. What's implied, but not stated, is that essential often means someone who can cause trouble. Even studies in experimental economics show this stress. In ultimatum game studies, where a person suggests how to divide an amount of money and another can either take it or leave it, fairness appears to be what wins. Poor deals are turned down, even if it means a loss for oneself. If repeated rounds and keeping track of reputations are introduced, strategy comes into play. Players start to balance being fair with showing their strength. They test where the limits are. Those who show early on that they're tough often get better deals in the long run. People who are purely cooperative, the consistently good ones, are taken advantage of in the start until the group adjusts. Here, ideas about fairness give way to acting powerfully in an adaptable way. I was surprised at how quickly people switch from being moral to strategic when they see what's in it for them. There's something else too. In 2001, psychologist Robert Livingston studied how people view leadership and friendliness. He learned that friendliness makes someone more likable, but skill and strength make people seem more like leaders. When forced to pick, people put strength first. This is very clear in politics. Voters often say a candidate is strong or decisive as a main point for why they support them, even if the candidate's ethics are questionable. The public says we appreciate goodness. Election results suggest we fear being seen as weak even more. And here's what people rarely say. Being morally consistent makes you predictable. Being unpredictable gives you power. Niccolo Machiavelli wrote that it's safer to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. Most see this as being cruel. That's not quite right. In this context, fear means being strategically unclear, making others think that if they cross you, there will be consequences. Someone who is always forgiving doesn't seem like they'll bring any consequences. I once talked to a manager at a large global company who said she was too ethical for politics. She wouldn't put down her colleagues, take praise for what her team did, and was honest about her mistakes. Within 3 years, she was dealing with problems made by colleagues who did the opposite. Her honesty became something others took advantage of. When I asked why she didn't change, she said, "That's not who I am." Her identity became tied to her moral behavior. The cost was not just slower career growth. It was feeling tired mentally, the quiet anger from seeing less ethical people deciding the rules. Those who study organizations might say this is about having limits, set boundaries, and communicate clearly. However, that explanation makes the problem seem simpler than it is. Organizations reward those who can cooperate, but also hold back when it benefits them. Those who can act virtuous in public, but negotiate fiercely in private. Goodness, without thinking strategically, becomes giving away too much data. Think about Adam Grant's research in Give and Take. He discovered that givers are both at the bottom and the top. The difference? Successful givers are picky. They mix being generous with looking out for themselves, protecting their own interests while assisting others. Purely selfless givers either get worn out or are used by others. What people usually remember from Grant's work is the positive side, that giving can lead to success. The less mentioned point is more direct. Being openly good is a weakness in competitive situations. This is where the idea begins to fall apart. We tell kids that being honest and kind is always rewarded. In reality, it's rewarded sometimes in places that ensure everyone gives back. Remove that assurance, add competition, and make information uneven, and the rewards change. People who think strategically see this sooner. I'm not saying being cruel is the path to victory. That's another easy myth, that the world is run by bad people. More often, it's run by people who know where the limits are, who understand when to appear cooperative and when to show some aggression. What makes one uneasy is how typical this is. Not dictators, but department heads, startup creators, even leaders of social groups. For the worker at their desk, the price of being good isn't just an abstract idea. It's being in a meeting where one's idea is used without credit. The performance review that praises one's teamwork but gives the promotion to the colleague who fought harder. It's slowly understanding that being morally consistent makes you easy to read, and being easy to read makes you easy to handle. Here, the standard explanation hesitates. If goodness alone doesn't guarantee power, what does that mean for the moral structure of our institutions? And more quietly, if being good isn't enough, what are we actually teaching people to become when we claim that it is? If being good isn't enough, then the more uncomfortable question comes up. Why are we taught so carefully to believe that it is? The training starts early and isn't theoretical. In 1963, Stanley Milgram did his obedience tests at Yale University. The usual lesson repeated in books is about authority and cruelty. However, look more closely at what the participants were thinking. Most complied not because they were evil, but because they had learned to link obedience with being correct. When a man in a lab coat said, "The experiment requires that you continue," the participants felt stress, sweating, trembling, but they continued. They had learned long before entering that lab that following legitimate authority brings approval and safety. Good behavior meant following directions. The experiment showed something more profound than obedience. It showed a reward system learned early on. Approval means survival. In classrooms, this idea is built in intentionally. Alfie Kohn, who studies education, has written a lot about reward systems in schools, like gold stars, grades, and public praise. In many studies throughout the 1980s and 1990s, giving rewards based on performance improved obedience in the short term, but lowered internal drive. Children work for the sticker, not to truly understand. I was surprised how obvious the result was. The child who follows directions gets clear praise. The one who questions the rules becomes difficult. Over 12 years of education, a pattern forms. Being predictable earns rewards. This doesn't create morality. It creates manageable behavior. Consider the well-known Stanford marshmallow experiment done by Walter Mischel in the late 1960s. The popular story is about waiting to get something better later and future success. Children who didn't eat one marshmallow to get two later had better results in life. However, studies that repeated this decades later made the story more complex. When researchers accounted for stable financial situations, the predictable power weakened. Children from unstable situations ate the marshmallow right away, not because they lacked character, but because they couldn't rely on promises. Here, the idea falters. What we call virtue might just be adapting logically to how rewards seem to work. We teach children that patience, obedience, and following instructions will pay off later. However, the situation decides whether that promise is reliable. The business world copies the classroom almost perfectly. Performance review systems rely heavily on teamwork and being a good fit with the culture. A 2015 study in the Academy of Management Journal showed that workers who did pro-social behavior, helping colleagues, volunteering for extra tasks, got higher performance ratings. On paper, that seems fair. Look more closely at how those ratings are handed out. The same study discovered that being visible makes the reward bigger. Quiet contributors get less credit than those who show they're helpful strategically. So, goodness must be acted out to be rewarded. I once worked with a junior analyst at a large advisory company who always stayed late to help senior associates. She thought honestly that her effort would be acknowledged. When promotions were given, she was called supportive but not leadership material. Another analyst, less helpful but more vocal about his support, moved up. The official reason mentioned executive presence. The reason not spoken was simpler. He made his cooperation visible and negotiable. She made hers unconditional. This is the illusion of reward. Organizations praise virtue publicly while secretly supporting who can negotiate. How people act can explain why this system is so steady. Skinner showed in the 1950s that giving rewards sometimes creates the strongest habits. When rewards are unpredictable but possible, people work harder. Casinos use this, and so do companies. Promotions are rare, bonuses differ, praise is inconsistent. The promise remains. If you keep performing well and behaving correctly, you might be recognized. The uncertainty doesn't weaken commitment. It makes it stronger. I find this worrying because it means the moral script isn't just cultural, it's built into our minds. Dopamine rises not when a reward is guaranteed, but when it's expected. Plus, there's also family influence. Diana Baumrind in the 1960s and 1970s researched parenting styles, showing that authoritative parenting, being both warm and in control, created children who were socially skilled. In this case, social skills meant reacting to social rules. Children learned to read expectations and change how they acted. That skill is adaptable, and it's also how people manage impressions. As adults, most people have a deeply rooted view. Goodness means approval, approval means safety, and safety means survival. That's why challenging the idea of reward seems almost immoral. Workers who say no to extra unpaid work feel guilty. Partners who set clear limits fear being called selfish. The discomfort is natural. It's not just social, it's learned. Here, the generally accepted explanation says society needs cooperation. Without shared rules, chaos erupts. That's true, but leaves out the imbalance. Cooperation stabilizes systems. The question that's rarely asked is who designs those systems, and who benefits the most from widespread obedience. Machiavelli saw this centuries ago. In The Prince, he wrote that leaders must seem kind, loyal, humane, and religious. Appearance keeps order. He also warned that a leader must know how not to be good when needed. People, meanwhile, are encouraged to see goodness as a duty. This imbalance is slight. People are trained to be consistent. Leaders are trained to be flexible. I didn't realize this clearly at first. I thought moral education was purely about forming ethics. Now, I believe it's also about fitting into society. When workers believe that effort and virtue always lead to advancement, stability grows. When that belief fails, people leave, unions form, or talent goes elsewhere. The illusion of reward isn't a secret plan. It's a helpful structure. And here's the lasting, uneasy feeling. If we're taught from childhood to link following rules with virtue and getting something later with moral value, then how much of our goodness as adults is truly what we believe and how much is training? If the training was for social order rather than personal power, what happens when someone decides to step outside of it? If most of us are trained for consistency, for visible virtue, for predictable cooperation, then an uncomfortable imbalance appears. Power runs on a different mindset. And this is where something unexpected emerges. Power doesn't just use the good, it mistrusts them. Not publicly, of course. Organizations praise honesty. Company goals are full of words like transparency, accountability, and ethics. Enron had clearly stated ethical guidelines in the 1990s, and so did Lehman Brothers before 2008. The presence of moral words doesn't tell us how much an organization internally accepts truly moral behavior. The mistrust is more quiet. It appears in who is chosen. In 2011, a study released in Psychological Science by Grabo, Van Vogt, and others looked at leadership choices when there was a sense of danger. When groups felt threatened, they picked dominant leaders, even those who were self-centered, over leaders who were for the good of the group. When things were stable, they liked cooperative traits. I remember thinking this was about the situation, but when you look at companies, threat is almost constant. Pressure to make money every 3 months, market competition, changes in structure. When there's always a threat, dominance becomes normal. A morally rigid person inside such a system causes stress, not because they are wrong, but because they are inflexible. Power structures rely on acting freely. Budget shifts, strategic ambiguity, only showing certain information. These aren't always illegal acts. They are tools. A person who shows they'll always stick to a principle lowers the number of options available. If talking about game theory, they narrow the strategy. This isn't just an idea. In 2013, a senior person in charge of following rules at a European bank quit after disagreements about how risks were being revealed. Colleagues called him too uncompromising. He wasn't said to be unskilled. He was called inflexible. The institution didn't need a villain. It needed choices. I didn't expect how often that word appears in managers' language. Choices. There's also information in psychology that explains why obvious goodness can make people suspicious. Research by Benoit Monin and Dale Miller in the early 2000s brought up the idea of moral licensing. When people build a reputation for behaving morally, they feel they have permission to act less ethically later. The opposite can be true too. Observers sometimes mistrust people who show high moral standards because they expect hidden dishonesty. Showing too much virtue can cause the do-gooder derogation effect. In studies, participants rated extreme altruists as less likable and more suspicious than moderate helpers. This idea is not often named in company life, but it exists. The worker who says no to small violations of rules, informally adjusting expenses, strategically leaving things out in reports, is seen as morally admirable but potentially dangerous. Not because they'll cheat, but because they might expose you. In 2017, a survey by the Ethics and AMP Compliance Initiative discovered that over 40% of workers who saw misconduct didn't report it, mostly because they feared being retaliated against. Now think of the opposite. The person known for sticking to strict ethical rules becomes a problem. Just by being there, they increase the perceived risk for others acting in ways that are questionable. The generally accepted explanation here is that good organizations value whistleblowers. Legally, that's right. Psychologically, it's more complex. Whistleblowers upset the stability. They shift the calculation of costs and benefits for everyone. Machiavelli warned that a leader must avoid being hated, but he also emphasized controlling information and perception. Absolute virtue is hard to control because it cannot be changed. You can reason with someone who is strategically moral. You cannot with someone who is absolutely principled. I saw this happening inside a fast-growing tech startup around 2019. One product manager always objected to how data was being collected, which pushed the boundaries of user permission. She mentioned regulatory rules, raised concerns about privacy, and wrote about the risks. People in leadership called her idealistic. Funding rounds were finishing. Market share was at stake. The question wasn't whether she was right, the question was timing. Her sticking to her principles slowed things down. Eventually, she was moved to a less important role. Officially, it was a restructuring. Really, it was to reduce stress. From a worker's view, this feels like betrayal. You're told honesty is essential. Then you learn honesty depends on the situation. Another factor makes this more complex. Studies on power by Dr. Keltner at the University of California, Berkeley, show that people who gain power become less empathetic and more impulsive. Power changes how you see things. When someone at the top judges a morally rigid worker under them, they aren't just judging ethics. They're judging how controllable they are. Feeling empathy for the worker's inner struggle is lessened by status. Here, the idea of things being fair falters. Official stories claim that strong ethical rules create strong institutions. Yet, in reality, those who cannot adjust their principles are filtered out of roles with high authority. This doesn't mean power prefers dishonesty. It prefers flexibility. For regular workers, the feeling is confusing. You follow training on ethics. You sign codes of conduct. You learn the language of responsibility. Then you notice which behaviors help careers move faster. Strategic silence, calculated agreement, selective disagreement. The hidden idea isn't hating goodness. It's managing risk. A consistently good person lowers some risks, fraud, deception, but increases others' exposure, constraint, unpredictability under pressure. This creates a lasting problem. If systems quietly sideline those who cannot bend, then goodness isn't just undervalued, it's structurally inconvenient. The question that follows is more uneasy. If power mistrusts the purely good, does that mean staying successful at higher levels requires bending one's morals? If so, where does flexibility end and corruption begin? If staying at higher levels requires flexibility, then one trait becomes especially fragile. Agreeableness, not kindness in theory, not empathy as a human quality, but measurable behavioral agreeableness. The tendency to avoid disagreements, focus on harmony, and give in during talks. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, industrial psychologists started mapping how income changed with personality traits. Timothy Judge and colleagues studied large sets of data over time and discovered a consistent pattern. Higher agreeableness predicted lower earnings, especially for men. The effect wasn't big in any single year, but it added up. Over decades, the difference grew. I remember staring at those charts and thinking that this could not just be about politeness. Something else had to be happening. Research on negotiations provides some answers. Linda Babcock and Sarah Lashever, in their 2003 book, Women Don't Ask, noted that people who start salary talks earn greatly more over time than those who take initial offers. In experimental exercises, agreeable participants were less likely to start talks and more likely to accept worse terms to keep things friendly. People usually explain this as a lack of skills. Learn to negotiate, practice being firm. This explanation avoids the deeper tension. For highly agreeable people, negotiating isn't just a skill they lack, it's a threat to how they see themselves. I've seen this in performance review cycles. A worker who often gets high praise from peers hesitates to question a decision about pay. Their inner thoughts are almost moral. I don't want to seem greedy. Meanwhile, a less agreeable colleague sees negotiating as something expected. Same company, same measurements, but different inner limits. Here, the theory starts to bend. Agreeableness is praised socially, especially in cultures that focus on the group and jobs that center on care. Yet, the reward structures in competitive organizations quietly favor those who cause friction. Some data from experiments makes this uneasy. In 2010, a study released in Organizational Behavior and Human Decision Processes examined how observers viewed negotiators who were firm versus those who were accommodating. Those who were firm were seen as more skilled, and they were more likely to be chosen for high-stakes tasks in the future. Those who were accommodating were seen as more likable but less leader-like. The distinction is clear: being likable doesn't equal authority. Authority decides how resources are given out. Agreeableness also affects putting limits in place. Research on bad behavior at work done by Christine Porath and Christine Pearson in the early 2000s showed that workers exposed to rude behavior showed worse performance and more thoughts about leaving. Here's what's not often stated: people high in agreeableness were less likely to deal with bad behavior right away. They internalized it. Over time, that internalizing adds up. The agreeable worker becomes the easiest to manage. Extra tasks come their way, and emotional work grows. A 2018 Gallup survey, workers who mentioned doing invisible work, mentoring, smoothing conflicts, supporting team morale, were mostly women and early career staff. Much of this work is unpaid and not recognized. Agreeableness makes one reliable for this role, and reliability becomes an obligation. I didn't expect how quickly helpfulness can become an expectation. There's also a darker strategic level. Social dominance theory, created by Jim Sidanius and Felicia Prado in the 1990s, suggests that group organizations are kept in place through clear power and subtle beliefs that make it seem right. Highly agreeable people are more likely to support fairness and equality, yet less likely to use confrontational ways to challenge inequality. They might privately object to unfairness while publicly keeping the group united. From a Machiavellian angle, this works well. A system kept stable by cooperative members needs fewer rules. The agreeable majority supports the structure through everyday obedience. Consider decisions to cut back companies. During changes, managers often count on team players to handle changes, training replacements, writing down processes, maintaining morale. These workers rarely object openly. Their inner discomfort shows as stress, not rebellion. The company sees endurance as loyalty. Meanwhile, those willing to strongly disagree, threaten to leave, or use other job offers to their advantage often get better severance or retention packages. The system reacts to believable threats, not quiet endurance. The generally accepted idea is that agreeableness helps teamwork and makes people feel safe. And it does in stable places with standards to give back. But when there is competition, agreeableness without putting limits into place becomes something that can be used. I once worked with a founder who said one of his top engineers was too nice for leadership. The engineer always did a good job delivered consistently, helped with team conflicts, and didn't take praise publicly. When a director role became available, it went to a more combative candidate. The reason was that they needed strategic toughness. The unstated reason was clearer. Leadership required the ability to disappoint others without showing it. Agreeableness makes it harder to disappoint others. The surface's mechanism is an area that often goes unacknowledged. Influence over others is only part of what power means. A crucial aspect is the capacity to handle relational tension. People who can't tolerate being disliked for a short time will find it hard to lead. Being too agreeable makes it harder to withstand such tension. However, eliminating agreeableness altogether leads to instability. Studies on psychopathy in business settings, such as those by Paul Babiek and Robert Hare, show that while people who are highly manipulative and lack empathy might rise quickly, they can cause damage to the organization in the long run. Pure antagonism destroys trust. So, the system seems to favor a mix, selective agreeableness. Be friendly on the outside, but firm underneath. This creates a kind of cognitive dissonance for the average worker who is naturally agreeable. You're praised for being helpful, reliable, and supportive. At the same time, you notice that people who interrupt, challenge, and negotiate forcefully gain status faster. The advice you get is contradictory. Be a team player, but also stand up for yourself. The idea of a balanced personality doesn't quite capture the situation here, since the burden isn't shared equally. Some people are naturally more at ease with confrontation. Others find it physically stressful, with their heart rate increasing and cortisol levels rising. Asking them to lean in isn't neutral. It's asking them to go against their basic nature. This leaves a nagging question. If agreeableness helps groups stay together, but weakens their negotiating power, and if leading requires being able to handle conflict, are we choosing leaders based on their ability to withstand being disliked rather than on their wisdom? And if so, what kind of moral character gradually rises to the top? If leadership favors those who can handle being disliked, then virtue starts to shift from being a strength to being a limitation. Not because morality is wrong, but because once morality becomes part of who you are, it becomes predictable, and power can work around predictability. This is where the trap closes. In 1957, Leon Festinger introduced the theory of cognitive dissonance. When your actions go against your self-image, you feel psychological discomfort. People then change their beliefs or behavior to regain internal consistency. This theory is usually discussed in terms of hypocrisy, but when applied to moral identity, it reveals something deeper. If I see myself as a good person, I have to act in a way that is consistent with that identity, even when the situation changes, which makes me less flexible. I was surprised to see how often a strong moral identity is linked to being easily manipulated. In 2011, Aquino and Reed published research on how people internalize moral identity. They found that people who strongly internalized moral traits like honesty, compassion, and fairness were more likely to act consistently with those traits in different situations. This seems admirable, but in negotiation simulations, those with a strong moral identity felt more uncomfortable using competitive tactics, even when those tactics were legal and expected. They were less willing to threaten to walk away or to hide strategic information. Their self-concept acted as a restraint. Now, imagine that person in a system where others treat morality as something that changes with the situation. This dynamic is almost a textbook case in abusive relationships. Studies on coercive control, including Evan Stark's work in the 2000s, show how abusers take advantage of their victims' commitment to being understanding and forgiving. The abuser reinterprets harmful behavior as stress, trauma, or misunderstanding. The morally committed partner accepts blame to keep the relationship going. Their virtue becomes the very thing that keeps them trapped. The same structure appears in workplaces, just in a more subtle form. In 2016, a study in the Journal of Business Ethics found that workers with a strong moral identity were more likely to engage in organizational citizenship behaviors, unpaid, voluntary contributions, even when they were being treated unfairly. They justified their continued effort as a matter of personal integrity. Again, theory falls short here. We expect injustice to lead to withdrawal, but some people instead double down. They refuse to let the system corrupt them. I respect that instinct, but it can reinforce exploitation from a strategic point of view. There's also the phenomenon of moral elevation, the warm, emotional response to seeing virtue, which Jonathan Haidt studied in the early 2000s. People who witness altruistic acts report feeling inspired and wanting to help others more. Organizations use this implicitly with public recognition ceremonies, stories of sacrifice, and award for going above and beyond. These rituals reinforce the idea of the selfless contributor. What is rarely examined is what is given up as a result. When virtue is celebrated publicly, it becomes something to aspire to. Workers compete not only for bonuses, but also for moral reputation. The person who refuses to work overtime feels selfish next to the colleague who is praised for staying until midnight. The control is indirect. No one issues a threat, but the standard is internalized. This is the moral trap, control without coercion. I once spoke with a senior nurse in a city hospital who described chronic understaffing. She regularly skipped breaks, covered extra shifts, and mentored junior staff. When I asked why she didn't push back harder, she said patients would suffer. Administrators relied on that answer. Budget issues were real, and so was her exhaustion. The institution ran because her identity wouldn't allow her to withdraw. Official management language describes this as dedication. The hidden mechanism is dependency. There's another layer that bothered me. In experiments on making people feel guilty, such as those conducted by Roy Baumeister and his team in the 1990s, participants were made to feel guilty were much more likely to agree to requests for help. Guilt increases prosocial behavior. In organizational settings, subtle cues like the team is counting on you, or we all need to step up, activate that mechanism. For people who equate their worth with being morally reliable, saying no triggers internal punishment. No explicit threat is needed. The self-enforces compliance. Machiavelli wrote that people are ungrateful, fickle, and false when it suits their needs. He advised rulers to understand this variability. What he didn't emphasize was consistency. A ruler who is bound by his own virtue is predictable, and predictability can be exploited. This doesn't mean abandoning ethics. It means recognizing that a moral identity that hasn't been examined can be used as a weapon by systems and people who don't share its constraints. From the point of view of the average worker or partner, the feeling is confusion. You're proud of your principles, but you also feel increasingly trapped by them. Saying no feels like a betrayal, not of the organization, but of yourself. Meanwhile, those who are less attached to their moral self-definition move through the same structure fluidly, sometimes opportunistically. The socially acceptable narrative says to stay true to your values, and the right environment will reward you. Sometimes that's true, but environments are rarely pure. They are a combination of cooperation and competition, sincerity and calculation. The trap isn't that virtue exists. It's that once virtue becomes identity, it resists adaptation, and systems favor those who can adapt. So the tension increases. If moral identity can be used to get compliance without force, is goodness still a freely chosen position, or has it become a leash we put on ourselves? And if someone learns to loosen that leash strategically, do they become corrupt or simply dangerous to those who rely on their restraint? If someone learns to loosen the leash of moral identity strategically, we instinctively call them dangerous. But dangerous to whom? That question is where Machiavelli becomes less cynical and more insightful. In The Prince, written in 1513, Niccolò Machiavelli argued that a ruler must learn how not to be good when situations demand it. This line is quoted endlessly as proof of immorality, but if you read it carefully, something more specific appears. He doesn't advise being cruel all the time. He advises deviating selectively. The prince must appear merciful, faithful, humane, and religious, but be ready to act against those virtues when survival requires it. The hidden truth isn't that goodness is useless. It's that goodness acts as a signal. Modern psychology confirms what Machiavelli sensed without experiments. In 2008, researchers Willer, Feinberg, and their colleagues published studies on moral reputation. They found that people who publicly displayed moral behavior were given greater trust and influence within groups. Once that moral capital was established, they were given more freedom in decision-making. In experiments, participants allowed people who were previously moral to allocate resources with less scrutiny, even when the outcomes were unequal. I didn't expect the halo effect to be so strong. Past virtue bought present discretion. This is reputational leverage. Consider how corporations brand their leadership. After the 2008 financial crisis, several banks launched ethics campaigns with community initiatives, sustainability reports, and philanthropic partnerships. Public trust had collapsed, and rebuilding a moral image restored investor confidence and regulatory goodwill. The moral narrative wasn't separate from power. It was the foundation for it. At the interpersonal level, the mechanism is more intimate. Studies on impression management by Mark Bellino and others in the early 2000s show that employees who engage in ingratiation and demonstrating moral commitment and self-sacrifice receive higher supervisor ratings. But here's the important detail. Those who combine moral signaling with political skill benefit the most. Political skill, as defined by Gerald Ferris, includes being socially perceptive and appearing sincere. That phrase, appearing sincere, is key. Machiavelli wrote that people judge more by appearances than by reality because everyone can see, but few can truly perceive. He understood something about cognitive shortcuts long before Daniel Kahneman formalized System 1 and System 2 thinking. We rely on surface cues, warmth, consistency, moral language to assess trustworthiness. So, power curates goodness rather than rejecting it. I once watched a senior executive at a multinational firm during a restructuring around 2020. Publicly, she emphasized transparency, empathy, and shared sacrifice. Internally, she made ruthless cuts to divisions that were deemed non-strategic. Employees described her as tough but fair. That wording is revealing. The fairness narrative softened the severity of the decisions. She didn't deny morality. She framed the decisions as necessary stewardship. From the employee's point of view, the experience was disorienting. They believed in her values, but they also lost their jobs. The moral framing reduced rebellion. People accept pain more readily when it's packaged as principled. This aligns with research on procedural justice by Tom Tyler. In the 1990s, Tyler found that people are more likely to accept unfavorable outcomes if they see the decision-making process as fair. Seeing fairness reduces resistance. Leaders who understand procedural optics maintain authority even when distributing loss. The idea of authentic leadership feels insufficient here. Authenticity implies that inner values align with outer behavior, but high-level influence often involves carefully calibrated presentation, calibration, not falsehood. The hidden truth is that morality functions as both currency and camouflage in systems of power. There is empirical data on what psychologists call strategic prosociality. In 2014, Barkley and Willer showed that people become more generous when they are being watched, especially when there are chances to improve their reputation. Altruism increases when others are watching. This doesn't invalidate the altruism, but it puts it in context. Machiavelli wouldn't be surprised. What troubles me is how this feels from below. The average worker who internalized goodness as identity experiences cognitive shock when they realize that virtue can be performed strategically. They might see it as hypocrisy, but those at higher levels often frame it as pragmatism. And here, theory struggles again. If moral signaling grants discretionary power, then the most actors aren't the most virtuous or the most ruthless. They're those who can shift between the two, who accumulate moral capital and then use it when it's to their advantage. The prince, Machiavelli wrote, must be both lion and fox. The lion frightens wolves, and the fox recognizes traps. Pure goodness is neither, and pure aggression is unstable. The hybrid survives, but mixing the two introduces a moral gray area. If virtue becomes a tool rather than a principle, does it still have moral value, or does it become just theatrics? For the person watching this dance from below, the lesson is unclear. Should you remain consistent and risk being marginalized, or should you learn the choreography of appearance? And if everyone starts to perform goodness strategically, what happens to trust, the very thing that moral signaling was supposed to secure? If everyone starts to perform goodness strategically, trust doesn't disappear overnight, it mutates. It becomes conditional, calculated, and provisional. And this is where the real unease begins, not in obvious corruption, but in the gray area where survival, ambition, and ethics overlap. The zone of moral uncertainty isn't dramatic. It doesn't look like villainy. It looks like justification. Albert Bandura's work on moral disengagement in the 1990s mapped the cognitive mechanisms people use to act against their own standards without seeing themselves as immoral, such as using mild terms, shifting responsibility. When corporate executives approved of aggressive financial products before the 2008 crisis, internal memos rarely used harsh language. They spoke of innovation, competitiveness, and shareholder value. Bandura, the use of mild terms reduces self-condemnation when people take harmful actions. I used to think that moral compromise involved conscious betrayal, but the data suggests something quieter, reframing. Consider the case of the Ford Pinto in the 1970s. Internal cost-benefit analyses compared the cost of fixing a fuel tank flaw to the payouts for burn deaths and injuries. The numbers were calculated, and the decision was rational within that framework. The engineers and managers weren't cartoon villains. They were operating inside a system where financial metrics structured moral evaluation. When harm is turned into numbers, it becomes abstract, and the emotional weight shifts. For the average worker, this zone feels like tension in the stomach. You notice a discrepancy, with sales talking up their claims, stretching the truth, and data collection going beyond what users clearly understand. But raising an objection might risk their position or influence, so they soften the language, suggesting improvements instead of confronting deception. The theory of whistleblowing becomes fragile here. Research by James Dedert and Ethan Burris in 2007 showed that employees are more likely to speak up when they feel psychologically safe and believe their input will be valued. Speaking out decreases sharply in cultures with stronger control of power or rigid organizational structures. Silence isn't always about being a coward. It's about calculating the costs. Machiavelli would understand this instantly. Survival comes before purity in turbulent times. A prince who refuses necessary cruelty might lose his state, and a worker who refuses strategic deception might lose his job. But this is where the internal fracture forms. Leon Festinger's cognitive dissonance returns. When behavior goes against internal standards, the mind adjusts the narrative, saying, "This is temporary, everyone does it," or "If I leave, someone worse will replace me." Each justification reduces psychological discomfort, and over time, the threshold shifts. There is experimental proof of this gradual slide. In 2015, Francesca Gino and her team conducted studies on what they called the slippery slope of dishonesty. Participants who took part in small acts of cheating were more likely to escalate in following rounds, with brain imaging showing reduced emotional response to repeated dishonesty. The amygdala adapted, meaning that repeated compromises recalibrate moral sensitivity on a biological level. I didn't expect that adaptation to be so measurable. However, refusing all compromise can lead to isolation. In 2013, a study in administrative science quarterly looked at ethical dissenters in organizations. Those who challenged leadership were more likely to be marginalized, labeled as not being team players, and excluded from informal networks. The code of conduct remained intact, but informal procedures did the rest. From the person's point of view, the experience is lonely. They weigh two costs: moral discomfort versus social exclusion, and neither feels right. This is where Machiavellian intelligence becomes tempting. Not cruelty, but calibration. You learn when to object publicly and when to negotiate privately. You build alliances before raising concerns, accumulate reputational capital before challenging authority, and speak the language of the system while nudging its boundaries. Ethics training rarely addresses this dimension. It presents a choice of right versus wrong, but real environments operate on shades of gray. And here, the paradox sharpens. If you remain rigidly good, you risk irrelevance. If you become strategically flexible, you risk eroding your sense of self. Both paths are costly. For the partner in a strained relationship, the worker in a pressured firm, or the manager balancing targets and values. The question is rarely, should I be good? It's how much compromise is acceptable, and that threshold is rarely spoken. What unsettles me is how quickly situations become normalized and how a crisis justifies an exception, which sets a precedent and becomes the new culture. At what point does adapting become transforming? And when you finally look back, can you still see the line where flexibility ended and compromise began? When you finally look back and try to see that line clearly, you realize that it was never fixed. It moved with context, incentives, and fear. That realization forces a different question. If pure goodness is delicate and pure calculation destroys trust, then what's left? Redefining goodness isn't about abandoning ethics. It's about separating morality from helplessness. In 2019, researchers in leadership psychology began revisiting the idea of tempered radicals, originally described by Deborah Meyerson. These are people inside organizations who held strong values, but acted strategically rather than confrontationally. They didn't announce revolution. They built coalitions quietly, framed ethical concerns in business terms, and accumulated influence before pushing for change. Long-term case studies showed that these actors were more likely to sustain change than those who relied only on moral protest. I didn't expect that the people were both politically skilled. This aligns with research on power by Adam Galinsky and his team. Studies in the early 2000s that people who feel powerful are more likely to act in line with their internal values rather than external pressures, meaning that power increases already existing qualities. If that's true, then moral influence requires some degree of structural leverage. Good intentions without positional strength remain just that, aspirational. From the point of view of the average worker, this feels odd. You're told that integrity stands alone, but the data suggests that integrity increases with influence only when combined with agency. Consider the case of Paul Pullman at Unilever, starting in 2009. He publicly shifted the corporation toward long-term sustainability goals, even refusing quarterly earnings guidance to reduce short-term pressure. Analysts were skeptical and investors resisted, but he didn't frame sustainability as just a moral virtue. He framed it as strategic resilience. Revenue growth during his time there strengthened his position, and the ethical agenda survived because it was tied to success. This isn't purity, it's synthesis. Psychologically, this synthesis requires something uncomfortable, being able to be aggressive without being controlled by it. Studies on assertiveness training since the 1970s show that people who learn to directly express boundaries report feeling less stress and greater self-efficacy. The difference in those programs is between aggression and assertiveness. Aggression violates the rights of others. Assertiveness defends one's own. In negotiation studies by William Ury and Roger Fisher, effective negotiators separate the people from the problem. They remain respectful while being structurally firm. Here, goodness isn't compliance, it's disciplined clarity. Machiavelli's lion and fox metaphor returns, but with a different meaning. The lion without the fox is trapped, and the fox without the lion is devoured. These is strategic maturity. I once watched a department head in an institution who personified this. When budget cuts threatened layoffs, she didn't publicly condemn upper management. Instead, she gathered data on results, tied her case to priorities, and secured alternative funding streams before the final meeting, with colleagues describing her as principled as well as calculating. From below, this kind of leadership feels protective rather than exploitative, with the difference being intent and not the absence of strategy. There's also neurological that moral courage correlates with the regulation of emotion. Studies using imaging have shown that people who resist authority display activity in areas associated with self-control, like the prefrontal cortex, meaning that resisting pressure is a strength. The earlier fear of corruption meets a frame. With flexibility doesn't betrayal and rigidity, not integrity. The story says that goodness means being nice, accommodating, but the real story suggests something more. Goodness that power must endure conflict, withstand, and reputation. For the relationship, this may mean setting boundaries, and it may mean declining while professionalism, with the may mean using to protect from harm. None of this is simple. It requires one's own ability to, when is as in and when is as in. The redefinition is goodness control and agency creates with. And yet, even here, a final question remains. If strategic morality becomes the new behavior, how do we make sure it doesn't turn back into at what point does calculated virtue become from the control it was always to resist?